this program with me today are going to be Yona and Naomi. And for those of you who haven't collaborated with JYCM or attended JYCM events before, we are the first American Jewish youth-led climate organization, and we were founded just this past year by Chazon. We're committed to mobilizing the Jewish community and the world at large to take action against climate change. And we're mostly fighting to create a more equitable and sustainable world through the lens of Jewish values. And we believe that Jewish tradition compels us to respond to the current crisis, which is kind of the whole point of the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest. So it's great that this whole thing is happening. And we also think that youth have the power and the responsibility to play a really important role in that response. Right now, our storytelling campaign, which has been happening for the past couple of months, is coming to a close. And for the past few months, we've been trying to shape the broader Jewish community's understanding of our stake in the climate crisis through broadcasting diverse climate stories and creating a communal narrative to unite Jews around the issue of climate change. The campaign is really designed to bring in all Jewish institutions, synagogues, and youth groups into the movement with us, which is, again, why we're all here for the Big Bold Jewish Climate Fest, and just show that caring deeply about climate crisis is central to the modern Jewish identity. So today we'll be focusing on storytelling and helping all of you who are here craft your climate stories. So before starting, we just wanted to take a moment to recognize that the ground beneath our feet is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced out of their homes. So I'm going to drop a link to a map in the chat, and you can use that to locate the names of the tribes for your location. And then once you've found it, if everyone could just share your names, your pronouns, and the tribe that you find for your location in the chat, just to get to know each other a bit better, because this is kind of a small program, so it would be great if we all knew each other by name. So one sec, let me just drop this link. And what you can do with this map, it's pretty cool. You just like search up your location and it will tell you. And you should put your name, pronoun, and the tribe. There we go. Yeah, so you can all use what Yona just put in the chat as an example of what you should be doing. Okay, thank you all so much for doing that. In the meantime, Madeline, do you want to screen share the presentation so we can start on that?
Great, so I think we'll get started here. Manuel, you can go to the next slide if you'd like. So first we're gonna think about why is it important to tell these personal stories. So personal stories are so important because they relate to the viewer or the listener, whoever's hearing this. When you, as a viewer, are hearing somebody's firsthand experience, can be a really powerful and moving thing because that storyteller has this personal connection to the story, and the audience will feel that connection as well. If you tell that personal story, opening up and becoming vulnerable yourself, that will motivate those hearing the story to become vulnerable and begin to think about their own personal story. So telling personal stories can be a really great way to get people involved in the climate crisis and really to see these issues. So how can you put this idea of personal storytelling to practice in climate work? And something called the public narrative. Public narrative, as you see, is a leadership practice that inspires and empowers others to join the narrator in taking action for justice. Organizers tell stories that draw connections between personal experiences and a broader social problem that requires immediate attention. And public narrative calls for collective action. This leadership is about taking responsibility for cultivating the energy of people to find shared purpose and to take action in a moment of fear or a problem or uncertainty. And you are leading by speaking your story to some public group, by using your truth to connect with others around you. Public narrative can be extremely powerful. So the topic of your public narrative can be whatever you want it to be, as long as it's powerful and resonant and demonstrates why you're in this movement. Like I said before, You want your public narrative to be personal and inspire change and motivation. You want your audience to think and then hopefully act, making a personal commitment to climate work. In a little bit, we'll hear some examples of personal climate stories, and I want you all to keep thinking about these foundational qualities that make a public narrative powerful and moving. Public narrative also relies on rhetoric and creates emotion. Emotion is what draws your listeners in and makes them feel the urgency of your story. Once you lay out this emotion to your audience, you can turn it on to them asking for action.
Yeah, exactly. So narratives shape emotions, and that's what drives people to take action. So some action motivators are urgency, anger, hope, and solidarity. And these are some themes and emotions that you can insert into your narratives to drive people to take action, which is really the purpose of telling these stories. Some action inhibitors are inertia, apathy, fear, isolation, and self doubt. And of course, it's completely okay to include some of those elements like self doubt and fear in your narratives because these are often emotions that go hand in hand with fighting climate change. But it's often more productive to focus on messages of hope or solidarity, encouraging people to take action. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so some things that we talk about when we're shaping our narratives are these three elements: the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. So, in including all of these three elements, you can craft a story that invites others to be in relationship with you personally and understand where you're coming from. Also, inviting others to join your community through focusing on shared experiences or shared values, and also inviting others to take action with you and focusing on the urgency of the moment. So, Naomi's going to explain a bit more about those three elements.
So we start with the story of self, which is the bulk of your public narrative, so maybe 2/3 of your story. It could be something where climate change is an overt threat to you. Maybe you live in a frontline community that has serious risk with wildfires, rising sea levels, flooding or intensifying storms, reduced crop yields for like rural or farmland, things that directly affect you, maybe suffering from asthma and living near like an oil plant, growing up in a community experiencing environmental racism, maybe a space that you love and hold dear to you is in jeopardy. Um, but it could be a less direct or conventional approach, tying the climate movement from another element of injustice, large or small in scale. So, some of the examples of this could be like a family financial struggle, exposing the correlation between a broken economic system and the exploitation of the fossil fuel industry, experience with bullying as a child, leading you to discover the power of your own voice, maybe hearing in synagogue traditional Jewish tales of protecting sacred things, participating in Shabbat dinner conversations about historic Jewish influence in social justice efforts, making you want to be active. And then maybe your family's Jewish history of persecution compels you to understand intergenerational trauma and existentialism from an early age, committing you to fighting in a crisis that disproportionately harms the world's oppressed peoples. We live in an intersectional world, and no one understands this better than our generation. Ultimately, the story of self you tell should consist of the bulk of your public narrative, telling the story of who you are and how you, your family, and or your community struggles taught you something about the world and brought you to this moment. From here, you go into your story of self. Place yourself and your personal story in the context of the community and audience you're targeting with your narrative. Emphasize the values you've learned and developed from your stories of self, values which you listed, values which you list, which, sorry, I'm getting tongue tied. Um, Values from your story, and explain why your experience is universal amid a struggling public. It's important to note that this doesn't mean you demonstrate why your story of self is identical to the lives of the public, especially when telling a quintessential Jewish story outside of your kibbutza or a Jewish, format or audience. The cultural details of your story of self may be foreign to people listening. So, with the story of us, take 2 or 3 sentences to portray how the struggles you underwent, choices you made, and ideas and values you internalized resonate with everyone. The story of us calls on the audience to internalize the ideas you shared and the values love, pain, yearning for change, how they're universal, which takes us into the story of now. This is where you culminate tying the whole public narrative into the reason we're here, conducting your activism, standing up to the powers to be standing up as a group with your audience now with you because of your story of us. This is the time to illustrate why your personal experience and the values you guys share connect to the abuse and injustice of the climate crisis. This is your rallying call. This is what gets everyone left with an impact after the speech that says we want to rise up and create change together. Yeah,
So it's really important to recognize that the climate story is really just a story of generations, right? Generations past has suffered the effects of climate change. It is not just a thing. We are seeing the brunt of it right now as it's getting worse, but it's really something that's been affecting generations to past. And it's just one of the many things that connects us to our ancestors. When telling your climate story, it can be helpful to draw from these stories of past generations. The climate crisis is really the greatest existential threat of our global time. And you can see in this next slide, we'll see some of the destruction that it has caused to some places that we hold really dear in the Jewish community. Today, the world defines the climate crisis as the greatest existential threat of our time. The consequences are terrifying. As you can see here, a sixth mass extinction is ensuing, and unmitigated, the results will be catastrophic. We are in a fight for our very survival and the planet as we know, for the very survival of our peoples, communities, cultures, and heritages. As you can see here on the photo on the left, we have some people carrying a Torah out of a flooded synagogue. So we have really, our communities are being destroyed, not just Jewish communities, but just communities as a whole are being destroyed by climate change. The gravity of this moment is that we, the Jews, understand far too well. While the world panics and scrambles, we can practice introspection. Our history is one of protecting our individual tradition and surviving in a world greater than ourselves. We are phenomenal survivalists. We take existential threats seriously, and the climate crisis is the existential challenge which we are here to combat today.
Sorry, it wasn't letting me unmute. But yeah, as you can see, those are some really shocking and emotive images, and sometimes it's helpful to add pictures along with your stories. So a few months ago, JYCM wrote an editorial for the Peoplehood Papers. It's just a news publication about what the Jewish response to climate change should be. And yeah, journalism is definitely one form of storytelling. So I'm just going to read out an excerpt from what we wrote as an example of how you might begin formatting your own stories. So here's an excerpt that kind of relates to the pictures that we just saw. JCC's aflame during uncontrollable wildfires, Jewish neighborhoods uprooted and scattered in the wake of hurricanes, wet ink smearing the pages of Torah scrolls waterlogged during floods. We can already witness these tragic scenes playing out on the global stage today. And what's next? Sukkot spent with the colorless walls of a barren sukkah, praying for fresh produce and the end of a drought that seems permanent. Passover gathered around a Seder plate of leafy greens wilted in a suffocated heat wave while we recite the plagues of old. Tisha B'Av observed in mourning of all the synagogues assailed by the commonplace disasters characteristic of the worsening climate condition. These are the images of a dying world. Our community will suffer future catastrophes in unending multitudes. Our holidays will lack their seasonal significance. Our traditions will morph into the unrecognizable. This is the great existential threat of our era. Jews have weathered many an impressive storm before, and we are adept survivalists. We must reinvigorate our environmental tradition and demonstrate the weight of Lador Vador, generation to generation, by rising up collectively against the climate crisis. So those who come after us deserve the richness of a culture Jews have maintained and cherished for millennia. So there's definitely quite a bit of fear and desolation present in that story, but we ended on a note of hope and action, and on the note of reinvigorating our environmental tradition and rising up to take collective action. So that's another thing that's important to keep in mind. The way that you end your story and the feelings that you leave the reader with can be really important. We can go to the slide after that.
All right, so now we're going to share a couple of our own stories, me, Yona, and Rafi, because the power of storytelling is vast. Stories can generate empathy and understanding, as well as push people to action, which is what we're hoping to foster throughout this campaign. So I'm going to start by giving you an example of what this story could look like. My climate story begins with a poem I wrote after Rosh Hashanah services in 2019. Goes like this. When a sound system breaks in a synagogue, during Rosh Hashanah services, the speakers emit a noise too close to a gunshot. It is lightning, and the thunder that follows is anxiety so thick you can smell it. Every person stops, waiting for it to happen again, a second shot or a scream or something to say that was a gun. When it doesn't come, after 3 seconds that have stretched themselves into a year-long wait, when everyone has surveyed the door nearest to them, or how quickly they could climb under the seats, when each mother has instinctively put her hand across their child's chest, and the choir and the rabbis stare unknowingly into the crowd, silenced. When the cantor finally says, "Is everyone all right? Okay then, let's continue." It isn't until that moment the temple breathes again. So, the idea here that everyone's mind immediately jumped to a potential shooter in the building expresses a really terrifying reality of anti-Semitism today. The poem takes us from a completely normal service 1 minute to the most intense kind of fear, which is fearing for your life and the lives of your family around you, the next. And today, each of us lives this terrifying reality of the story of being a Jew in America today, which is to know that what I was so lucky didn't happen very well could have. And yet, the ending of the poem, quote, "The temple breathes again," is such a miracle, because just like that, everything was okay. To me, as a climate activist, this story evokes a sense of jealousy. In the climate movement, we've been robbed of that right to have that resolution, to have that breath, because we know we're walking into a fight that is so far stacked against us. If we wanted to have a real chance, we would have had to start addressing this in the 1960s. There isn't a momentary spark that sets off our climate fears and a resolution to those fears the next moment. It's a continuous and unwilling dredging forward into a terrifying future. And as a Jewish teen, I think I get to uniquely understand what those feelings can do, not just in the moment when you hear a speaker break, when you think it's a shooter, but over time with climate fears. Now, obviously, it's comparing apples to oranges, and I don't mean to use either of these important issues to invalidate the other. Climate urgency is not an insult to anti-Semitism, it's a motivation. It gives us as Jews an understanding that other people might not have, to know what the climate crisis means more than anyone else. We've stood in spaces where we feel unsafe and scared, but then we find an exit. Global warming means this kind of fear 100% of the time. And especially as a youth climate movement, we're young. We shouldn't have to be doing this work, but here we are. Because everyone on this call knows that we deserve that moment of breath. We deserve to breathe again. And when we breathe, we deserve to be breathing clean and protected air. We deserve to breathe as Jews, and we deserve to breathe as environmentalists. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, for that really great story. So, like I said before, my name is Jonah. I use he, him pronouns. I'm going to be sharing a hybrid digital and film animation video I created earlier this year about climate change. So telling a story through art or any kind of digital media can be a really powerful and direct way to share your feelings on an issue, in this case, climate change. Through this video, I wanted to show the influence of money and large corporations and individuals into the pollution of our Earth, as well as the devastating effects that we have been facing. But I also wanted to show the hopeful side of this crisis, which is us, the youth, rising up to fight for a better future. So using digital animation and storytelling, I was able to capture and show these ideas. So I'm just going to show you, here is my digital animated short, Change is Possible.
Thank you so much, Yona, for that video. It was super powerful. I know that I kind of like get the chills every time I see that video. So definitely the kind of emotional response we're hoping to elicit with these stories. So now I'm going to share my story. You just heard a poem with a reflection and a video, and this is just kind of like more of a personal written reflection. So yeah, start. There once was a man with two pockets, each containing a note on which was written a quotation from Jewish tradition. When the man felt desolate, he reached into one pocket and read the words, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created for me. When he felt prideful, he reached into his other pocket and read, Va'anochi afar ve'efer, I am but dust and ashes. Thus, he lived a balanced life. I grew up hearing this Hasidic teaching often. The crux of the tale, how can we aim to change the world while maintaining humility? Thus far, fighting the climate crisis has mostly filled me with moments of discouragement, in which I'm compelled to look to the words, the world was created for me, for comfort. When I learn that deforestation is responsible for at least 15% of global greenhouse gases per year and hear about fires ravaging California and recall the myriad natural disasters that have rendered millions of people climate migrants over the past few years, I feel like I am but dust and ashes and can't possibly make a difference because this issue is just so huge and so complicated that nothing I do can possibly be enough. When I was 10 years old and became a vegetarian, it felt like enough, like I was finally taking concrete actions that would result in concrete change. But then I discovered that humans eat 65 billion chickens per year and knew that obviously my individual decision not to eat chicken wasn't nearly enough. When my neighborhood's farmer's market opened a composting service and my mom and I began composting, I felt so righteous each time we placed our batch of compost into the bin. But somehow we were still headed toward a positive feedback loop of climate change. And scientists were saying that we had 12, then 11, 10, 9, 8 years until the effects of climate change became irreversible. And my righteous acts were clearly having no impact. And even when helping to found my school environmental club, hosting guest speakers, and working to make our school more sustainable, which feel like big things, I understood that the microcosm of my school was only one small battle in the larger war of climate change. And whether we won or lost our battle would not significantly change the outcome of the war. And finally, working with JYCM, I finally feel as though I'm part of something big and something important, but discouragingly, I can't physically see that we've made any appreciable difference. Growing up in New York City, where we're definitely beginning to feel the effects of climate change, but not as significantly as in other places, I learned that being an environmentalist meant stopping people from littering and always recycling, and I learned very little besides that. When we had hurricanes, few people linked them to climate change. But now there will be a seawall around Staten Island by 2025. Now people are waking up, and still there's that nagging voice that nothing is enough, that we are but dust of the earth, and putting up a seawall is putting a band-aid on a problem that requires far more than that. I love snow and cold weather, and I love looking at the sky. I love the changing seasons and the feeling of possibility that comes at the beginning of each one. And I don't want to lose winter or parks or beautiful weather or my future or anyone else's future. But until recently, I was convinced that a dim future was inevitable. Over the summer, however, we read, along with many other JYCM members, I read Jonathan Safran Foer's book, We Are the Weather, and it changed my thinking immensely. In the chapter Dispute with the Soul, Foer narrates a conversation between himself and his own soul. His soul asks, have you noticed how often conversations about climate change end with a question of hopefulness? Foer challenges, have you noticed how often conversations about climate change end? This is why collaboration in the climate movement is so crucial. Multiple people are required in order to hold a conversation, and it is our job to ensure that conversations about climate change don't end. Perhaps I personally am but dust of the earth, but upon converging our molecules of dust by coming together and mobilizing our communities, we are significant, and we are for whom the world was made. I know this when I listen to the stories of my friends who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, or when my school environmental club works with the administration to reduce waste. The world was created for us, and our collective power is reason for hope. So you guys just heard 3 examples of climate stories that are pretty different from each other, one in the format of a poem, one in the format of a video, and one in the format of like a personal reckoning in the form of an essay. So now we're just going to reflect on those for a couple of minutes. You can either just write on a piece of paper or on your computer, whichever is easier. And just answer the questions, where did you see the story of self, us, and now in the stories that you just heard? If you remember from the beginning of this, those things are kind of straightforward. The story of self is just where you see the personal story reflected. The story of us is where you see collective values. And the story of now is where you heard urgency in the stories? And how do you think you might go about incorporating those things into your own narrative? So I'll just paste those questions into the chat to keep in mind, and we'll just journal about those for a couple of minutes. Okay, so hopefully those couple of minutes of reflection were helpful in just kind of beginning to organize your thoughts about what your stories might look like. Now we're going to go into breakout rooms for some more focused work on forming our own climate narratives. So Liana, if you can make the breakout rooms, that would be great.
Hi, if everyone's back now, we just wanted to leave a couple minutes for open sharing. If anyone has questions or something, an idea they stumbled upon that they thought was impactful that they want to share, or just a little recap of what you talked about with your group, the floor is open. Just unmute yourself.
I can share something that I was thinking about based on the conversation we had in the breakout room. One thing I was thinking about is all the ways that people are affected by climate change without knowing it. Like I live in New York City, for example, and in a lot of the boroughs, there are extreme levels of air pollution all the time, but people don't even really think anything of it because it's not really at the front of their awareness. And New York City is projected to be underwater in 50 years, but this again isn't really something that people are thinking about because they're so focused on the present. So I think the idea of really awakening people to what's already going on and what will be going on in the future is something really important.
We talked a lot in my group about like maybe feeling overwhelmed or feeling isolated in your fears and feeling like if it's not your whole identity, like this isn't something you can really change. And I thought that was really interesting because Bruce and Natalia had two really different takes on the same like big issue as far as what we can be doing just to create like small change with the people around us even.
This is Nigel. I just wanted to say in a personal sense that it was really interesting for me to think about my story now. Like I have an origin story. I'm the CEO of Khazan. I have an origin story about Khazan and why I founded it, what I was doing then and stuff. But the notion of thinking about like, what's my story now? That's actually a really interesting question. I think it's a really good question. And I sort of sit with that. I think that's interesting. And the professional thing that I just wanted to say is thank you to each and all of you, everybody who's involved in JYCM and this panel. And it sounds so trite, but I really find this like rich and inspiring. Yona, that video was like so cool. And I really, and I was also thinking this in the little group, that a not insignificant piece of this is about supporting each other, building relationships with each other, like literally one at a time, person by person. And each of us who feels strongly about these issues sometimes feels really inspired and fired up, and sometimes feels like, ugh, it's only me and what can I do? And in a sense, that's exactly why we founded JYCM in the first place, so that you guys slowly but surely become like a fighting force, and not just externally affecting change within and beyond the Jewish community, but as it were internally, like actually really supporting each other and brainstorming in ways that I'm just seeing you model. So I really want to thank you for that, and I really want to encourage you all going forwards.
Does anyone else want to share maybe their idea for their story that they came up with?
I can share. So an idea for my story that actually Yona helped me develop a little bit more in my mind was how travel is such a big part of my identity, and seeing the different practices and all the different places that I've visited has been really key in like helping me navigate what changes I can make in my own life, and seeing how different people are approaching these issues and how it's affecting these different countries and different cultures so differently. So that's something that I've really found an interest in and want to keep exploring. And I would say it is my story of now and of self. And it's also like going to be changing depending on where I am in life and what location I'm in. So maybe it's not the now, maybe it's or not the self, it's the now. I have to develop that a little bit more, but it was getting the wheels turning. So.
Yeah, for sure. So we wanted to talk about just a last thing to leave you with. We want you to finish these stories, to keep writing them, to keep developing them, or not writing, maybe producing a video like Yona, or whatever art form speaks to you. And if you finish that, submit it to our website. Yona put the link in the chat, and we can get those published on our website, and maybe you can share them at some events if you end up getting more involved with us. There's also an opportunity to submit them to a JGirl. They sometimes will do that. Rafi can put that in the chat and a little more information on that. And the last thing is that you can join us tonight at the Future of the Movement, a conversation with youth climate activists event, which is 7 to 8:30 Eastern, for one of the culminating events of the whole festival. And there's also a link in the chat to that. Yeah, so thank you so much for coming and for participating today.